It found that while the domestic worker national minimum wage is currently set at 4,400 Rand, the reality is that on average, female domestic workers are paid 3,349 per month. And with the cost of living so high for ordinary South Africans, this poses survival challenges for these workers. Well, to explore some of the issues further, I'm joined by Luke Kannemeyer. He's the COO at Sweepsouth. Thank you very much, Luke, for joining us. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of your survey, just tell us about your methodology of research and how many domestic workers you actually surveyed.
So this survey was started by Sweepsouth around 7 years ago. We had started the company 10 years ago to really try and use technology to disrupt this sector that really hadn't seen much change. And from that first survey where we had a few hundred workers, we now have gone to a few thousand. So this year we had 5,600 workers from across the country, primarily from Cape Town and Gauteng. And there were 10,000 of our own workers surveyed, 10,000 workers who had been with us in the past, and then 20,000 of those who had never been on the platform. So for us to see how does Sweepsouth have an impact in the lives of domestic workers that we bring on, but then also to see what is the sector at large, what are the conditions like there as a whole.
Yeah. So what were some of the key findings from your survey, and were there any notable distinctions from one province to the next?
I think what we see is that Cape Town and Johannesburg are certainly doing better than anywhere else in terms of the domestic worker population, both in terms of pay and in terms of conditions, whereas KZN especially seems to have seen a majority of the job losses in the sector. So this is one of the key findings that we see, is that during COVID, we obviously saw an expected massive downturn in the industry, and that what's not spoken about is how we effectively have 125,000 jobs. So that's 15% of the sector that hasn't materialized. So we haven't bounced back after COVID, with affordability and relocation being the primary reasons why employers are getting rid of domestic workers. And this is very, very worrying given the importance of the sector to so many.
Yeah, you talk about relocation, but surely if people relocate, they're going to employ people where they relocate to, or not necessarily?
I think what we're seeing here is that there's often relocation is driven by affordability. We see a large trend, especially post-COVID. It was slightly less this year than last year, that immigration played a role. But then we also see a semigration trend going within the country to, say, smaller towns. And often people here, if it's affordability driven, are going to smaller living spaces that they can take care of themselves. But also, I think this is an important thing to recognize about domestic work, and this is where we really do want to see legislation catch up, is that it is largely part-time nowadays with multiple employers, and even those who remain employed. So you can keep employed, but someone moves and they're downsizing, they'll get someone for fewer days a week than they had in the past. And all of that in turn impacts on earnings, impacts on the availability of work in the sector.
So with domestic workers on average earning less than around 1,000 Rand compared to what the minimum wage dictates, that is the national minimum wage, what sort of impact does this have on these workers' ability to survive, especially because in many instances, with them mostly being women, they are the primary breadwinner?
Yes, so we see 83% of the primary breadwinner, usually supporting around 4 dependents, so 4 financial dependents, and many are single caregivers. So this is an extremely large responsibility placed on these women to provide for their households. And what we see then is that with many South African domestic workers, that our social security system, our grant system does fill some of that gap, but it still leaves workers basically being able to just take care of their basic costs, and it leaves them vulnerable to any financial shock. And what we also see in our survey is the hunger here to do better, to get education, to train, to move on to better things for themselves and their family, but they just do not have the means or anything above just surviving day to day.
So we've seen, of course, in the recent data from the quarterly labour force survey that households are letting go of domestic help because of the high cost of living. And this is obviously devastating for these workers. I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what support structures do domestic workers realistically have? And do you think that more can be done at a policy level to help fill the gaps that they experience?
I think certainly when we spoke about earlier how a monthly minimum wage, there many fall below that. And the difficulty here is that we used to have more nuanced regulation around regional pay, weekly pay versus monthly pay, whereas national minimum wage is only hourly at the moment. And where this is certainly something where we want to see domestic worker earnings increasing, and that this is work. So there's no reason it shouldn't be benchmarked with other workers. That what that means then is that like you have legislation here and you have policy that there's not too much there other than a need to adapt to what this work sector actually is in terms of the part-time, variable nature, multiple employer. And I think this is where access for me, seeing how do we apply excellent initiatives like UIF, like occupational health and safety that our constitutional court has said domestic workers should be entitled to. And how do we make this easy for employers to adhere to? And then how do we follow up with enforcement of that?
One last thing, Luke, when it comes to employers in the home not necessarily adhering to the national minimum wage, I guess the government can't really enforce that because it's a private home arrangement.
I think this is the difficulty with enforcement. They're sending out labor inspectors, and often given the nature of private homes, getting access and the amount of pay in terms of recovery, if you do issue fines, it's incredibly complex and difficult to do so. But this is where we can look at other mechanisms, introducing, say, instant messaging channels where adherence can be reported, where workers can report their employers. But I think that this is still where there's this disparate power in the system. People are desperate for work, so are not likely to do that. And I think this is the purpose of Sweepsouth's report, is to try and shine a light on this, try and urge employers to do better, but also to urge people to share this in their neighborhood groups. Go to sweepsouth.com, go to and read the report in detail. It has much richer information, but please talk to your friends and your family about it. Urge them to do better. This is not just government, not just one person. It's all of us who are responsible for improving this sector.
Indeed. Luke, thank you so much for your time. That was Luke Kannemeyer. He's the COO of Sweepsouth.